only 7% of those grieving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination. Only 7%. Now, with the disciples, you don't have 7%, you have 100%. You might have as many historians who deny the Holocaust as you do historians of Jesus who deny that he existed. It's a very fringe position.
Right.
I don't think the arguments for it is very good. And that's what Habermas did in his study. Said, well, okay, look, let's just look at some facts about Jesus that are relevant to his fate, that are so strongly supported by the data that the vast majority of scholars grant them as facts.
Okay.
If we can build a case for the resurrection based on those facts, then it'd be a pretty strong case for the resurrection. So he came up with 12 facts. Okay, 12 facts. And then he said, you know, just based on these 12 facts, a minimal facts, we can give a good case for the resurrection. Then he said, tell you what, let's do it this way. You choose any 3 or 4 of those 12 facts. And, oh, by the way, those 12 facts would only be pretty much the majority of scholars, wouldn't have to be the vast majority. So 51% or better. And then he said, tell you what, you pick any 3 or 4 of those, and we can build a strong case for the resurrection. And then he kind of morphed into it a little bit differently and said, I'll tell you what, let's just limit this to, and he's done different numbers at different times. I think he's doing 6 right now in his magnum opus. In our book, he did 4. We did 4 plus 1. But they would be facts that are agreed on by the vast majority of scholars. And he said, let's just take these facts and we can build a really strong case for the resurrection based only on those. So if someone is going to come against the resurrection hypothesis, you either have to show that our method is wrong, or you have to dispute the facts that we've chosen and say, well, no, those aren't really facts. I don't accept those. And the response of the minimal facts approach would be, well, that's your prerogative, but the vast majority of scholars do. And what's good about that is, you know, if I believe something like the disciples, or let's say the Apostle Paul, converted to Christianity after persecuting the church, if he does that because he has an experience he believes is the risen Jesus that appears to him, that's not saying it was the risen Jesus. It is to say that the experience was of such a nature that he interpreted it as the risen Jesus appearing to him. You know, you're going to have to give a reason why you reject that. And you're welcome to reject it, but this is what the vast majority of scholars believe. And so therefore, because there is strong evidence for it, not because scholars say it's true, but because there's strong evidence, and the evidence is so strong, the evidence is that strong is that the vast majority of scholars grant them as facts. And so the Christian, at least, is rationally justified in believing Jesus rose from the dead using a minimal facts argument. That's what the minimal facts argument is.
Okay, so you mentioned the 4 plus 1. So first we have Jesus died by crucifixion. Yes,
that's correct.
Now I know these off the top of my head now, but I've written them down just so I'm not messed up. I'm kind of nervous being here in the first place. But if you want to jump in, add anything, please. I welcome that. Okay, so Jesus died by crucifixion. I have Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Mara, Bar-Sepian, and the Talmud as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then the disciples believed that he appeared to them and were changed from 12 scared men into 12 bold preachers, really. Right? I mean, I'm reiterating all your work, so I mean, can you expound on the Paul's persecution of the Christians before he was converted?
Well, sure. According to Paul's own testimony in his undisputed letters, and let me put a bookmark here. When we say Paul's undisputed letters, there are 13 letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament. And of those, when we talk about the scholars, we're saying not just Christian scholars, not just conservative Christian scholars, but also moderates and liberals and agnostics and atheists and Jewish scholars, historians of Jesus. You know, we're taking all of these, you know, hundreds and hundreds of them that are commenting on these things. They've written on these. They thought it was important and interesting enough that they write on these things. All right. So, you know, they're saying evidence is really good that Paul, that of those 13 letters, Paul wrote at least 7 of them. All right. They think the evidence is good enough to say Paul definitely wrote at least 7 of them. Vast majority, almost all scholars who study the subject, regardless of their theological background, acknowledge those 7. And then it's about 50-50 on 2 others. And then there are 4 that the majority of scholars think Paul did not write them. All right, so when we're looking at a minimal facts approach, we're only going to use those letters of Paul that are the undisputed letters of Paul. In other words, everyone acknowledges he wrote those. So in Galatians 1, I believe it's verse 23, Paul says that they had not seen Paul the Christians had not seen Paul in Judea. They just knew or had heard that he who persecuted the church now proclaims the faith he once sought to destroy. Sounds like an oral tradition. So
Right.
Paul himself here is talking about a saying that was going around in Judea about him. He had persecuted the church, and now he's out proactively proclaiming the gospel. You have Paul in Philippians, I believe it's Philippians chapter 2, maybe it's chapter 3, where he gives his resume. And he says, look, I was circumcised the 8th day of the nation of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a Jew's Jew. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, I persecuted the church. As to the righteousness which is in the law, found blameless. So he's given his pre-Christian resume there, but he acknowledges being a persecutor of the church. In 1 Corinthians 15, another undisputed letter of Paul, he says, I don't know, somewhere between verses 9 and 17, he talks about how he's the least of the apostles because he persecuted the church. So Paul, in his undisputed letters, says that he persecuted the Christian church. And he also talks about how Jesus appeared to him, that he had seen Jesus. That's in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 8. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. In 1 Corinthians 9, he says, have I not seen Jesus? And then you have this narrated in the book of Acts, how Paul persecuted the church and the appearances of Jesus, Jesus appearing to him in Acts chapter 9. And then Paul reiterates this, at least Luke giving Paul's story in chapter 9, 22 and 26. So you have that. Then you have Paul, who acknowledges in his writings, I think 2 Corinthians, where he talks about his beatings, being shipwrecked, stoned and left for dead, imprisoned, all these hardships, and hunger and being shipwrecked, all of this stuff that Paul, the hardships he describes for when preaching the gospel. In 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about how he is under threat of death on a daily basis. And then you read about these persecutions in the book of Acts, the specifics to them. So, this is who Paul is. He converts when he has this experience that he interprets as an appearance of the risen Jesus, and it radically transforms his life to being one of Christianity's most aggressive advocates of the gospel. Right. And then we know Paul suffered tremendous persecution, and then there are later reports that he endured martyrdom by being beheaded. And even Clement of Rome, which is written, First Clement, which is written in the 1st century, mentions the martyrdom of Paul indirectly. But then it is also spelled out in several other of the early church fathers.
Well, excuse me, moving around. The sun is getting in my eyes, and it's hard to. I'm washed out over on this side. And can you just give me a bit of background about James, Jesus' brother, and his conversion?
Yeah. So the conversion of James isn't granted by as many scholars, but not many scholars write about him. When I did my doctoral research, I could only find 9. Let's see, is it 9? No, 3. There was only like 29 scholars I found. Let's see, maybe it's 9. Forgive me. I think it's 9 scholars. It's a very small percentage. It was like 9%, but there's only, it must be 9 scholars out of like 29. Now, it was only 9%. It wasn't many at all. Hardly any scholars even talk about it. So it must have only been like 3 scholars. Must have been 3 scholars. 3 scholars out of 29 I found that even talk about things. Was James a non-believer prior to Jesus's death? That's what they're talking about there. So not many. You have Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. It says, then he appeared to James. And then you find James in Galatians 1. He's part of the Christian church. In Galatians 2, he's part of the church apostolic leadership. Josephus, Hegesippus, and Clement of Alexandria report the martyrdom of James, the brother of Jesus. So you have this, but what's of interest, and what those 3 scholars out of the 29 that I found, what they don't acknowledge is that James was a non-believer prior to Jesus's death. The rest that do look at it, that they do think that Jesus was a non-believer if they comment on it. So, and there's good reason, I think, to hold that he was a non-believer. So, for example, I think it's at the end of Mark chapter 3, it says that Jesus' mother and brothers came to get him because they thought he was beside himself. In other words, they thought he was, something's going on here. So this is kind of embarrassing. Why would his brothers think he was beside himself?
Right.
And then in John chapter 7, verses 1 through 3, I think it is, they come to him and they say, hey, Jesus, look, we're going to go up to Jerusalem for the festival. Why don't you come with us? And you are doing these miracles. Don't do them in secret. Come on up to Jerusalem and do it publicly. And right before that, it said that those in Jerusalem, the Jewish leadership, were seeking to find Jesus so they might kill him. And so his brothers are saying, hey, why don't you do this stuff publicly in Jerusalem? So it's like they're egging him on. And then John says, because none of his brothers believed in him. All right. Now, the 3 scholars, I think it was James Tabor, John Painter, and Richard Bauckham. Those were the 3 that don't think that James was, at least at the time when I studied it. They didn't think that James was a non-believer. They interpret that differently. But I think it was a bunch of stretch, and I explain in my big book on the resurrection, that's like 700 pages, why I think they're wrong. Then you've got in John at Jesus's death, who does Jesus entrust the care of his mother to? Well, it's not to James. It's not to any of Jesus' brothers. And you would think if they were believers at the time that he would entrust the care of his mother to one of his brothers. But no, he entrusted to the beloved disciple. And I take that as Jesus is more concerned that his mother be taken care of by a brother in Christ than a blood brother. Right. So therefore, I think there's good evidence, good reason to think that None of Jesus' brothers were followers of Jesus prior to his death. But then afterward, we do find them as followers. And we find in 1 Corinthians 15, where it says, then he appeared to James. And like I said, you've got 3 accounts of James, his martyrdom, one of which is a non-Christian account. So I think there's good reason to see about the fate of James there.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the festivals, and I was looking back at the interview you did with Mike Winger, and I've wondered this myself. If Paul had ever met Jesus, and you were saying with that in that interview that they were probably at these festivals. Can you explain a bit about those festivals?
Yeah, so there were a number, I don't recall what they all are. Of course, Passover was the big one back then, right?
Right.
But there are a number of festivals that the Jews would go to during the year. And Paul, being a very committed Jew, being a Pharisee by his own testimony in Philippians, he would have been there at these. And Jesus was there, as the Gospels report. So, there's a lot of, well, there are a number of people who would say, Paul never heard Jesus. He never met Jesus. So he wouldn't have known what Jesus looked like when Jesus appeared to him, right? I don't think there's any reason to think that Paul never saw Jesus. If Jesus was at these festivals and Paul would have been there as well, then if Jesus did preach publicly at these festivals and cause the commotion that he did, such as the overturning of the table, cleansing the temple, the week of Passover, and that he was brought before the Sanhedrin that took him before Pilate the next day. Well, and then he was crucified publicly. Are we to say Paul never saw Jesus? Did Paul not care about all this while all the Jewish leaders and the scribes and Pharisees were coming against Jesus? If this is as the Gospels report, and as Josephus reports, at the instigation of the leading men among us, that he means the Jewish leadership, at the instigation of the leading men among us, Pilate crucified him. So if Josephus is to be believed, if at least the bare facts of the Gospels are to be believed, then I think we have good reason to think that Paul was aware of Jesus. He may not have ever spoken with Jesus, but he probably saw him and heard him preach at some point. So that's what I would go with. I think that's more plausible than to state dogmatically that Paul never saw Jesus.
Right. We just
I think
don't
it's more probable that he did.
Yeah, we don't have it written in the text, but it's easily inferred, right?
Yeah.
That this took place. So, you mentioned that you just finished a really big book, 700 pages on the resurrection. So that's
that was
really
back in
what I want.
2010. So that
Oh,
was 16 years ago.
yeah. Well, still, that's a big book. I'd be just getting through that now, probably, if I had started. Anyway, so can we just talk about the empty tomb for a little bit? So the arguments against the empty tomb. I have a list of them, but maybe you could address some of those. First one being disciples stole the body.
Well, first of all, I'd say let's look at the evidence that the disciples had these experiences and truly believed Jesus rose and appeared to them.
Okay.
So the fact, they're claiming it, right? I give 9 sources for that in the Case for the Resurrection of Jesus book. You've got Paul himself saying that he saw Jesus. Then he appeals to oral traditions, such as the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3-8. You've got the sermon summaries in the book of Acts, several of those. So there's oral traditions. And then you've got the written traditions. Matthew, Luke, and John talk about the appearances. Mark anticipates them, of course, in Mark 14:28 and Mark 16:7, I believe it is. And then you have First Clement and Polycarp's letter to the church in Philippi. So they talk about the appearances as well. So we know the disciples are claiming these things, but did they believe it? And what I'd say is we've got 5 first-century sources. You got a lot of sources that talk about the fate of the apostles, that they had, died these horrendous deaths and things like that. Some of them are late, some of them are embellished, some of them are like, I don't know that I can believe that. So I like to go with first-century sources. So with those, you've got Josephus, a non-Christian Jewish historian from the 1st century, that talks about the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus. You've got Paul, that talks about the persecution of Christians, of himself and other apostles. So you got Paul. You got the book of Acts that talks about that. That's 1st century. You got the Gospel of John that talks about it. John chapter 21. So this is written, we don't know exactly when John was written, but if we go with what the majority of scholars think, it's between the years 90 and 95. So what's interesting in John 21, you have Jesus and Peter walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee after breakfast. And he says to Peter, Peter, when now that you're young, you can go wherever you want, do what you want. But when you are old, someone is going to take you and bind you and take you where you don't want to go, and you will stretch out your hands. And John says this was to signify the type of death by which Peter would glorify Jesus. Now, church tradition says that Nero had Paul beheaded. So that would have been in the mid to late 60s, no later than the 68, but probably around 64, 65 is when Paul would have been beheaded outside of Rome. So if John's written between 90 and 95, that prediction is actually reporting what the martyrdom of Peter. So you got Josephus, you have Acts, you have Paul, you have John, and then you've got First Clement that talks about mentions the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. So you have 5 first-century sources that talk about the persecution and of all the apostles and the martyrdom of at least a few of them. And so the point to be made here is that liars make poor martyrs, that they are willing to endure intense persecution and willing to endure martyrdom for their gospel proclamation. It doesn't prove that what they were proclaiming, what they believed was true, because we know that jihadis are willing to give up their life in the cause of jihad. We know that people of other worldviews, Buddhism, and even atheism, Marxism, are willing to give up their lives for their causes. So the fact that the disciples were willing to endure persecution and martyrdom doesn't prove that what they believed is true, but it strongly suggests that what they believed, what they were proclaiming, was true. In other words, they weren't lying.
Right.
So I would go with that. And then you say, well, how do we know the disciples didn't steal the body? Well, if they truly believed Jesus rose from the dead, that wouldn't be the case if they'd stolen the body.
Right. Well, I was just looking at some of the arguments that people would give against the resurrection, for instance. Okay, so you have that one. You may be aware of Alex O'Connor, an atheist or prominent atheist right now. He said someone stole the body, and he mentions the gardener who didn't want the tomb area to become a shrine, mess up his flower beds. That's one of his arguments. Now, there's also
that's what Tertullian said. Tertullian said that was a rumor that was going around in his time, which was the end of the 2nd century.
Right. Wow.
But
So
if that were the case, remember, the disciples did not believe, with the possible exception of the beloved disciple, none of the disciples believed based on an empty tomb.
right,
The resurrection narratives, uh, you've got the Peter going away, confused. You've
yeah,
got the other disciples that are like Luke's gospel says, um, they didn't believe the women who said the tomb was empty because they thought that they were telling frivolous tales. And then you got Thomas who doesn't believe until he touches Jesus. So, and certainly Paul wouldn't have believed based on an empty tomb. He would have suspected that someone stole the body, right? So they believed based on their experiences of what they thought were the risen Jesus appearing to them. It was the appearance experiences that convinced them Jesus was raised, not an empty tomb.
mm, right. Okay, what about the swoon theory? Can you elaborate on that a bit too? The swoon theory?
Well, swoon theory, hardly anyone calls it that today. That came about over 100 years ago, where they were saying Jesus survived death. Now, as far as we know, the first person, or at least the only extant source that suggests Jesus survived his crucifixion, was Celsus, who wrote in the middle of the 2nd century that Jesus faked his death. Okay, but um, I'm not aware of any real recent scholars who are suggesting that. You do, well, I think there are 2 French scholars in the 1980s who suggested it. And then you had, I think, 2 physicians in the British Journal of Medicine, or one of those, it's a British medical journal, and they suggested it, but it's like the final or um, the following journal uh, publication of that, you had a bunch of physicians come out and said, "No, you guys are loons. You're all wrong on this."
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any. Well, yeah, let's see, Barbatarian. I don't know if she's still alive. Maybe she is. I don't know her age. So really radical member of the Jesus Seminar, and I mean, really out there on the fringe. And as far as I know, she's the only bona fide scholar who says that Jesus survived his death. Um, they put herbs on him in the tomb, and he was healed. He came out. He married Mary Magdalene, and they went off to, I think, France and had children there. But nobody really accepts that. As far as I know, she's the only bona fide scholar, uh, within the last 40 years or so, who thinks that Jesus actually survived his death. It's just there's every reason to think that Jesus died by crucifixion. I mean, you've got all the ancient reports, even non-Christian sources who report that Jesus was executed by the Romans. You only have 2 accounts in antiquity of someone surviving crucifixion, and in both cases, they were removed from their crosses uh, intentionally while they were alive and assisted. So um, we have no evidence that Jesus was removed while he was alive, or that he was provided any medical care whatsoever. And historians, at least, have to go with evidence. And given all the evidence we have for Jesus' death by crucifixion, historian at least has to conclude that Jesus was crucified and the process killed him. And then finally, well, I mean, I could give several more reasons, but I'll just give one more. I mean, Jesus had been impaled to the cross with nails. So even if he was removed prematurely and medically assisted, what would he look like just a couple of days later? Would he be able to walk on feet that had been pierced by nails? And even if he did, I mean, I don't see how he could, but if he did, he'd be limping severely. He'd been scourged. There's no way that he'd be able to convince his disciples that he was the risen Prince of Life.
Right.
Yes, alive, but risen, no.
And then the disciples would probably say, well, if that's a glorified body, I don't know if I want it either.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Count me out. I'm going to find something else to do here.
Yeah. And I mean, there's also the piercing of the side where the pericardium is pierced and the blood and water flow separately, right?
Yes, I accept that, but a lot of scholars think that that is, they don't accept that because they
Hmm.
think it's symbolic in John.
Ah,
But no, I think that it's historical. In fact, Quintilian says he's got a text, a passage that says that the Roman soldier is permitted to pierce those who were who have been crucified, and that seems to work with the be consistent with the piercing of the side.
now, Mike, if you have some time, could you go into the mass hallucination theory when Jesus appeared to 500 plus, over 500 people at one time?
So the hallucination hypothesis is like today most critical scholars don't offer an alternative natural hypothesis because they've come to realize they all fail. Um, so they just basically like to say, well, historians are out of, uh, they are prohibited from adjudicating on a miracle claim because a miracle would have to be performed by God, and historians have no access to God or to a source of something like the cause of a miraculous event. So they could never determine that a miracle occurred. That's pretty much the most popular line that skeptical scholars take today in reference to what happened with Jesus. But when scholars do take an alternative hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis is still the most popular. Even though it was pretty much refuted over 100 years ago, it has had a resurgence among some, but even that one is dying off. It's important to understand what a hallucination is before we talk about refutation. So, a hallucination is a false sensory perception. You believe that you are sensing or perceiving something that isn't really there. So you think you're seeing something, perceiving it with the sense of your eyes, your vision, but it's not there. Or you thought maybe you heard someone call your name. You heard, it's an auditory hallucination, but no one called you. Taste, smelling, um, a sense of motion. So, like when you have a dream that you're falling and you wake up, that is called a kinesthetic hallucination. It's a sense of motion.
Right.
You remember when you got your first mobile phone, at your first one, and you put it on vibrate, silent,
Right.
um, and um, you were in a lecture or a meeting, and it went off, and you picked it up and looked at. False alarm. Nobody loves me. You know, um, that is called a tactile hallucination. It's a sense of touch.
Yep.
And so at some point, we've all experienced a hallucination. Okay. Now, the people most likely, most inclined to experience a hallucination are senior adults grieving the loss of a loved one. Now, I say senior adults because that's what they researched. And I asked the researchers, from what you've seen, what about young people who are grieving the loss of a loved one? And he said, well, it might be the same. We just didn't have any kind of research we did on that. So, whereas only across the board, about 50% of senior adults grieving the loss of a loved one, only 7% of those grieving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination. Only 7%.
Wow.
Now, with the disciples, you don't have 7%, you have 100%. He appeared to all the apostles. He appeared to the 12. That's in their early oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7. So that's one thing. The percentage of percipients is too high. Second, hallucinations, because they are false sensory perceptions, they occur in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality to them. So, in that sense, they're like dreams. So, if let's say there's a group of 100 people and they've all volunteered to do an experiment, we're all going to take a sleeping pill, we're going to go to sleep, and we have the intent to dream that we are in Hawaii on the beach at Waikiki. All right.
Okay.
Now, when we wake up in the morning, what percentage of us are going to have actually dreamt that we were in Waikiki on the beach. Well, I don't know what it would be, but it's not going to be 100%.
Right.
And of those of us who have the dream that we're on the beach at Waikiki, how many of us our dreams are going to be so similar in the details that we believe that we were all experiencing the same dream when we describe it?
Yeah.
Probably none of us.
Yeah. And
Well, so when you're looking at a group hallucination, again, this is a false sensory perception in the mind of an individual that has no external reality. So it is like a dream in that way. And so your group hallucinations are simply not possible. And it's funny, when I had before I think my first or second debate with Bart Ehrman, there was a book that was published by the American Psychological Association, a textbook on hallucinations. The title is Hallucinations, the Science of Idiosyncratic Perception. It had just come out, and I bought the book, I read through it, and they didn't say anything about group hallucinations. And so I emailed both authors, and one of them responded. I had asked, why didn't you deal with group hallucinations? And they said, well, we intended to devote a chapter to it, but we could not find any good evidence or even a documented case of a group hallucination. And so what's interesting is not only in the resurrection narratives in the Gospels do you have multiple group appearances, but even in the earliest tradition, the one that you mentioned, in 1 Corinthians 15, he appeared to the 12. He appeared to more than 500 at one time, most of whom are still alive, but some have died. Paul adds, in other words, they're still alive.
Yep.
You can ask them about this experience.
Right. Yeah.
And then he appeared to all the apostles. So there's 3 individual appearances to Peter, to James, to Paul, and then 3 group appearances to the 12, to more than 500 and all the apostles. So you've got these 3 group appearances. And since a group appearance is impossible, or even if you don't accept that, they're extremely rare at the very most. Extremely rare, if not impossible. And you got 3 of these in the earliest tradition in 1 Corinthians 15. Well, that doesn't seem to work. And then you've got Paul. Paul was not grieving Jesus' death. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have wanted to see or expected to see. So those are just 3 reasons there. And if you do grant the empty tomb, I do, but if you do grant the empty tomb, it's not one of the minimal facts. But if the tomb was empty, that'd be another reason to think that it wasn't a hallucination. Hallucinations don't produce an empty tomb. Hallucinations don't typically lead one to think that if they went to the person's grave, it would be empty. My dad, shortly after my mom died, a few months later, this would have been in 2014, he woke up in the middle of the night and believed he saw my mom there. Now, either that was an apparition of my mom, or it was a hallucination that my dad experienced of her in the middle of the night, brought on by grief. Let's just say it was a hallucination. I don't know what it was, but let's say it was a hallucination. I can tell you this, my dad did not think that if he went to my mom's grave, it would have been empty. So there are numerous reasons for rejecting the hallucination hypothesis.
Wow. Well, thanks. That's thorough. I appreciate that. Now I've got a few things here that are just kind of out there, like apostles experienced something, but we don't know what, and then that Jesus was an extraterrestrial. And, and as I think you said in the book, um, in one sense, that's true that Jesus is not of this world.
That's right.
But,
You can say in a sense that he is an alien because he's not of this world.
but not an ET phone home type of alien. Okay, so just quickly, how long was Jesus on the earth after he resurrected?
Well, according to the book of Acts, chapter 1, he appeared to them over a period of 40 days.
Okay, so there was no dispute there that the people could have come out and said, "Well, this is not who who it was, who Jesus said he was going to be, or whatever. There could have been a lot of opportunity there to disprove it, I think. And
Well,
so,
let's put it this way: looking now in retrospect, as historians, that's not one of the minimal facts,
right,
and you'd have a number of skeptics that would say, well, they just don't believe that part of Acts, right? And
okay,
they're going to reject certain elements within the resurrection narratives. That's why I'm saying I think Habermas's argument is pretty good. That if you just limited things to the minimal facts,
okay.
or what the non-Christian historian, Jewish historian Paula Fredrickson has said. Um, she calls them historical bedrock, facts beyond doubt. If you just limit it to those things, you still get a pretty strong case for the resurrection.
So, how soon were, I guess we'd call it congregations forming afterwards that were worshiping Christ? Is there any documentation on that?
Well, the Book of Acts would suggest it was fairly early, right? I mean, you've got when Pentecost came and the Holy Spirit fell on them, the promised Holy Spirit coming, that was 50 days after the crucifixion.
Wow.
50 days after the crucifixion, and it says that they were together in prayer. So you've got it at least by that time that they are fellowshipping together. Um, yeah, and then you've got many other reports in the Book of Acts about them getting together. So if you go with the Book of Acts, you've got no later than 50 days if you go with the Book of Acts. But certainly, even if you reject that, you've got Paul's undisputed letters that talk about how they are meeting and gathering together and worshiping and breaking bread together in the Eucharist, things like that.
Wow. Well, Mike, this has been such a great pleasure, and thank you so much for being here. Mike's books are available at risenjesus.com or also on Amazon. And if I'm not mistaken, Mike, you will be at the Apologetic Con in in Lakewood Ranch, Florida, at Grace Community Church in June. Is that right?
Okay, I'm not sure when it is. I know I've been invited to it, but
Okay.
I'm glad you mentioned the date. I'll have to check out when ApologeticCon is, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's
From the
a
information I have, it says June 8 and 9.
June 8 and 9. That's in Sarasota, right?
Uh, Lakewood Ranch, Florida. So I'm not exactly sure.
Oh, Lakewood Ranch. Okay.
Lakewood Ranch,
Um,
yeah. So my Florida geography is not that great.
all right, I'll have to check that out.
Check out where you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, thank you
Let me
so much.
mention. Can I just mention something real
Sure,
quick, Brian?
sure.
So, I teach at Houston Christian University,
Yeah,
and we've got a really good apologetics program there that you can take online, or you can do it on campus,
great.
or you can do diplomas. You can do a minor or a major in Christian apologetics there, or like I said, a master's degree. You can do. We've got a really fine program. We've got people that are taking a master's degree there. They're studying it, Christian apologetics, from all over the world and in all walks of life. We have professionals. We had, I think last year I had a medical student. We've had several attorneys and pharmacists and people like that who are taking courses just because they want to learn.
Yeah,
And
that's
so if
right.
you're interested, you can find out about it by going to hc.edu/defend.
Okay, that's awesome. Thanks. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I was curious about that. That if people want to go and do maybe just a course or two, not necessarily a degree, that might be something that people could do online too. So that's great. The um, the technology available is a lot better than when the case of the resurrection of Jesus came out. But I mean, that would be awesome to do that as well. So again, thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate You spending the time with us today, and it's been beyond what I was even hoping for. So again, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Brian. God bless you.
Thank you. Take care now.